Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Educator Collins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about Shuri Zero. We're going to break down this deck and really examine how good it is, how to play it, how to pilot it, what some of the weaknesses are, and some of the alternative cards you can use to still run this deck effectively. Had some really good responses to the last deck breakdown. So definitely putting out another one real quick. We'll see how it does. Let's get started. So Shuri Zero is basically, once again, from the namesakes. You've got Shuri being the most important card, the most core card that really activates a lot of your pieces. And then you have Shuri Zero. Zero isn't really as core as Shuri, but it kind of encapsulates what this deck is trying to do early. It's a really good tempo card. It lets you play some of these high, powerful, cheap cards without that downside that's usually attached to them. So it's just a core engine piece for your early game, while Shuri kind of locks down that late game. So what is the strategy? Right, the strategy is basically you play Zero, you play a high cost card, then you either play Taskmaster or Arrow or Armanzola, any way to finish it off. But you're essentially using Zero to copy a big powerful card. Then you want to use that big powerful card to kind of either win another lane or lock down a lane or use Arrow to prevent them from affecting your other lane. So definitely a very powerful deck. Even though it can be telegraphed, there's just so much consistency in being able to play 30 power out of nowhere that it's still really strong. Definitely one of the top decks in the meta right now. So here we have a standard list. This list is absolutely standard. I wouldn't actually recommend this list because there's no real surprises in a list like this. You just have everything bare bones, and your opponent kind of knows exactly what you're going to do. But I wanted to just have a skeleton, something you could start working with, and then go on from there. But we'll kind of talk about some of the changes you could make if you want to add a little bit of variety, a little bit more counterplay or interactions into a deck like this. So first off, we're going to be talking about Shuri. This is a core piece. If you don't have Shuri, you don't have this deck. This really just activates all of your powerful combos. If you really don't hit Shuri in a match, the game is going to feel a little bit more risky, a little bit more chances for your opponent to win. But once you get Shuri down, a lot of times you're able to complete the game, and it's just the most important piece in the deck and really just does everything. Should be nerfed, but like I don't even know anymore if it's getting nerfed, so we'll have to see how long this lasts. Next up, we have Red Skull. I decided to put Red Skull as a core piece because it's just the biggest Shuri payoff. It just unlocks all the other synergies you can do. Taskmaster's insane with this. Armanzola can be insane with this. And it just really lets you win a lane pretty effortlessly if you can get this to go off. So, yeah, definitely a very strong card. I would say if you don't have Red Skull, the deck does feel like it's missing something. So I decided to put this as a core piece and definitely an important part of the composition. Next up, we have Red Skull. Now, this I wouldn't say is necessarily core, but it just does so much work for you. 1 power for 3 is quite a lot. It's actually quite an insane stat line, in my opinion, for this type of card. And it just eliminates all of the downsides for all the cards you want to play. Red Skull, Titania, Lizard, Typhoid Mary, Atuma, anything like that. It just eliminates the downsides. So just a very, very strong one drop in a deck like this where you have all these high powerful cards with downsides. So really, really important piece. And next up, Taskmaster. I would say this is the best, most likely the best payoff for playing after a Red Skull. You just get to put 30 power in any of the 2 lanes. And since It's not really telegraphed exactly what lane you're going to put on. It's a little bit riskier for your opponent. And you still have that 1 mana left over to like end your turn with a Titania or like a last turn 0 or something like that. You still get to work with that extra mana. So, really, really powerful piece there. And last but not least, we have the She-Hulk. So this is an alternative win con. You can do something like play Shuri on 4, pass on 5. Then the She-Hulk is going to cost 1. You can play a 20 power She-Hulk and then a 20 power Taskmaster same turn. Or you can play a 20 power She-Hulk and an arrow and then lock them down, win one lane, lock the other lane down. So just adds a lot of alternative win cons for the Shuri deck, and it's just a good card. Makes a lot of sense. Definitely want to add it into your list if you have it. And now let's talk about the early game. So these are the cards that kind of give you the good tempo, and they also let you fight for priority. So priority is actually pretty important in this deck because if your opponent has priority, they can kind of do a lot of damage to what this comp wants to do. We're probably going to talk about it later in weaknesses, but you can lose to Shang-Chi, you can lose to Arrow yourself, you can lose to a good Cosmo, things like that. And if you have priority, you don't have to worry about it as much because let's say they want to Shang-Chi you, but you could play your armor to prevent that and things like that. So there are counterplays that you can do if you have priority. So fighting for priority early is pretty important. So some of the cards that allow you to do this is Zero, of course, but you can go 0 into Titania, 0 into Lizard. You can play Sunspot and then have that soak up the energy for the She-Hulk, and you have armor to protect your early game units. Now, there's not really a mid game in this deck list, so I kind of skipped that, right? Mid game is you play Shuri, like, okay. But there are a lot of late game options. These cards are the tools that your deck really uses to guarantee the win. And they're usually your strongest tempo tools. These are cards you want to see. You want to see at least one or maybe two of these, preferably two, right? Because you want to play 1 on 5, 1 on 6. But these are really how you lock down that win and get that reliable cube generation. So those cards end up being Red Skull, Taskmaster, She-Hulk, Arnim or Arnim, sorry, Zola. But yes, Red Skull we've talked about all these cards really. They're just really core pieces that give you all that power on a lane, and then you either translate that power into another lane, or you Zola it and move that power onto the two other lanes. So they just give you a ton of power. They're very safe, very consistent, as long as you are aware of what your opponent can do to counter it. So how do we pilot this deck, right? You want to use your early cards to set up the Shuri combo turn. So you just want to play your early cards. You don't really have to hold your early game, really. You just have to make sure that you're contesting the board and fighting for priority. You don't want to have a situation where you play your Shuri, but they have priority, and then they play Cosmo into the Shuri, right? That can lose you the game there. So making sure that you keep that early game tempo is actually quite important, just so that you don't have those scenarios where you think you're ahead, but they have priority and they get to do some really fancy things against you. Now, if you do lose priority, and let's say you play Shuri on 4, be aware that if your plays are super telegraphed, they could Shang-Chi you. Now, that's a little bit high level, so you're probably not going to be seeing people read your lane and where you're going to play your Shuri buff target, but it is something that you want to be aware of that could happen to you if you're not being careful or you're being too obvious. So, usually you want to play your buffed unit in one lane. Usually it's either by itself, so you can set up Arm and Zola, or it's protected by a unit, either armor or Cosmo yourself. And then you either set up the Taskmaster to follow up the buffed unit, or you play Arm and Zola, or you go Shuri plus another win con, right? So the other way of using it is, instead of playing something on 5, something on 6, You play your Shuri on 4, you pass on 5, and then you play She-Hulk plus something else on 6. So that could be She-Hulk plus Arrow, She-Hulk plus Taskmaster. It could even be like She-Hulk plus Titania if you don't have those tools, right? You have a lot of one drops. So there are other things you can do besides those big combos. But that is another win condition. The one downside for this is that a lot of times you won't have priority. And priority is very key because your opponent can arrow you as well. So if they arrow your lane and they have priority, they can move all of your cards to one lane and your arrow is not going to have that effect. So you always have to be careful if you're doing a She-Hulk play that either the arrow doesn't matter or you have the priority so that you can be the one dictating where your opponent's cards go. Now, I want to talk about some of the powerful plays, some of the reasons why this deck is so good. Your early game can be really strong. You could do something like 0 into Titania, 0 into Lizard, right? 0 into whatever you want, really. And you can get a ton of power early. You can do 2 mana, 8 power. That's really good. You could do, 3 mana, 8 power, that kind of thing. So you have a lot of ways to fight for the board early. That is really annoying, right? Someone's playing a Daredevil, but you play 8 power. Like, you're going to be winning these early games if you can get this early start. Next other thing is the Sunspot plus She-Hulk synergy, right? You're going to, if you want to abuse the She-Hulk, you pass on 5. So your Sunspot just gets all of that mana or all of that energy and keeps you fighting for the tempo. So if you have a She-Hulk, if you have Sunspot down, it's a lot easier to justify passing for the She-Hulk play. And then we have the big bomb, the big nutters, the Shuri into Red Skull into Taskmaster line. 62 power for 3 cards. It's just not fair. It's really not. And you always have to be aware that your opponent can do this or you can do this to your opponent. If they think they've won the Nexus, no, they didn't, right? They did not. So yeah, this powerful combo is definitely one of the key payoffs to a deck like this. So you have to be careful. You have to be aware that, okay, this is what I'm going to do, or this is what my opponent can do. And then here we have the 2 flex spots that I put in. This is really flexible for the meta. You don't need these cards at all, but I didn't want to have like optimal deck is the suggested start. I want to give you a skeleton and then we adjust from there. Adjust to the meta, adjust to what people are playing. If people are playing tons of ones, you might want to change it up and add a Killmonger or something, right? If people are playing ongoing decks, you run a Enchantress, right? So this is just, I think, the 2 most unnecessary parts of this composition. Though you don't actually have to run a lot of these cards. You definitely need the Shuri, but a lot of the other cards aren't 100% necessary, but they're just common. So they're more standard and less a flex spot. So we do have alternative for some of the flex spots. Cosmo is like my number 1 alternative, probably what I would be running, just because it does a lot for you. Even though it does a lot, it could do a lot for your opponent. You just have that safety knowing, oh, if I play Shuri and I play my, Red Skull on that Cosmo lane, they can't Shang-Chi, and that's a lot of safety there. Also, same thing with like what armor does for you. You can also go Chavez, Dr. Octopus. These are like big bombs that you can play. A little bit safety. Chavez kind of gives you that draw consistency. Dr. Octopus, 20 power down can win that lane even though they play 4 cards down. That 20 power can actually contest the lane and also completely screw what your opponent is trying to do. So that could be a cool, fun way of using Shuri. Captain Marvel is nice. Same thing with Vision. They're both kind of the same card where Captain Marvel, you get 12 power down. That 12 power can win you the lane or win you a lane by itself. And they have to basically fight every single lane because if they leave a lane open, well, now Captain Marvel is just going to take it for free. And then we do have some 3 energy options. You can see in the standard list we have no 3-drops, but you can definitely play 3-drops in the list if you want to. And I would say Maximus Polaris are the most common options, but you can also use Thor. Downside of Thor is that you mess up your draw, so you need to have Shuri already in your hand basically when you if you play Thor, but these are other tools that you can do. And we do have more options. So we also have Soren. Soren's the other tech to this deck, the other like potentially key card, but isn't really necessary and just kind of changes the deck in a small way. And since this is a series 4/5 card, it's not going to be likely that you have this. So it's definitely something you can try, but you don't need it at all. So it's not a key card or anything like that. So I wouldn't really worry too much if you don't have it. It doesn't really bother you at all. And then you have tech cards, right? You could also play your own Shang-Chi. You could play your Enchantress. You could play, Shadow King if you really want to be that person. But it's not really necessary for Shadow King. I'm very biased against that card. But Shang-Chi for sure you could put in if you really think that is what is needed against the meta that you're playing in. And then we have Ebony Maw, Atuma. These are just other big stat sticks that you can play. Does work with Zero, and has that effective cost to power ratio. So Atuma as well. If you're running armor, you don't really have the downside with Atuma a lot of the time. So it's definitely something you can work with. A lot of times, a lot of people don't have it since it's Series 4 card or recently Series 3. So it's very unlikely that you have this randomly in your collection. So not a lot of people are playing it, but I do think as it gets more common, more people might start adding it in. Then we also have some alternative 2-drop options. So we have Scorpion, Scarlet Witch. There are other 2-drops that you could play, but these are some of the more common options that people like to play. I'm definitely a big Scarlet Witch fan myself. I do think you don't really need it in this deck list, so I think you can get away with ignoring it, but you can definitely play it and see if it works for you, if it works for the meta, if it works for the hot location, feature location, etc. So those are some of the alternatives that you can do. Now let's talk about some of the core card alternatives. I would say there aren't really alternatives to Shuri, and there aren't really clean alternatives to Red Skull. You could definitely try without Red Skull, but you're gonna notice like, ooh, I'd like that 30 power instead of maybe the 14 or the 20 that I'm working with. So that's kind of the issue there. There's no other card that can get you 30 power without blowing up your whole board, basically. So that's kind of the downside there. But if you don't have Zero and you have Soren, I would be confused personally, but you could definitely try running Soren instead of Zero. They kind of do the same thing, except Soren hits everything in your deck once you have it active. So it's definitely an option you can try. Vision you can replace instead of She-Hulk and Arrow. I definitely don't love this, but I do think if you don't have She-Hulk or something, you can definitely try Vision. 14 power Vision is really annoying because it's hard to contest every lane while having to keep in mind that this 14 power Vision could go into any place. So definitely think it is pretty good. I also considered Captain Marvel there, and I would have wrote it in, but it didn't look good on the page. That's my reason. But you could definitely play Captain Marvel in instead of Vision. You do lose 2 power, which is a lot, I would say. So I would say there's a bit downside. Vision you have to do like more work, but Captain Marvel is like brain off, but you do lose the 2 power, which I think is relevant. And then Chavez for Arrow. If you don't have Arrow, you can just try to have a more consistent game or more consistent draw by adding the Chavez and having 11 power deck list, and it means that your early game is going to be more consistent and the chance you draw Shuri is increased. So definitely think you could try that. I do think that you probably want to have She-Hulk and Arrow and Zero, but people always ask, "Hey, I don't have these cards. What can I replace it with?" So these are kind of my current considerations. I also think there are other things I'm not considering here. So if you have a better suggestion, definitely leave in the comments. I'm definitely willing to learn. I'm also definitely willing for you to share your wisdom to the rest of the community. And now, this was a feature that people wanted me to add going forward. So when to snap, when to retreat. I think essentially, if you're not in a position to snap, then you can think about retreating. So you don't actually need like a retreat guide. It's like if these things don't happen to you, then you can retreat. So if you draw Shuri and the combo piece, I think that's a pretty powerful tool, right? If you have Shuri plus Red Skull, you're probably gonna do well that game. So I'd say you can think about snapping. If you have priority with Arrow, so let's say it's turn 6 or turn 5, you know, okay, I'm gonna win this lane with whatever, and then I'll have priority with Arrow to lock down the other lane on turn 6, time to snap. Or if you have a very strong Zero early game, so you go something like Sunspot on 1, Zero Titania on 2, something on 3, right? Like that's gonna be very, very strong early game. And I think if you also have that Shuri in your hand, okay, easy snap. So those are kind of how I'd be looking at keeping that advantage, taking advantage of those advantages. And if these things don't happen, or your opponent's running a strong counter deck, or they're running high tempo, so you're losing priority, or you fought them before, you know they have a Shang-Chi in their deck, or the location's bad, right? All these things can be a reason to leave, to not risk it. So if you don't have a good start and then you're not comfortable with the locations, etc., definitely feel free to leave. Now, this is another suggestion from chat that we've added into these going forward. What are some of the weaknesses of this deck? So this is a strong deck. There's not that many weaknesses, honestly. That's why it's good, right? People don't like playing decks with obvious weaknesses, and if people are playing a lot of one deck, the deck is probably good. But there are still things you have to be aware of. I will say Shang-Chi is the biggest concern because you're giving tons of stats to one card. Shang-Chi will say, okay, bye-bye, one card. Right, let me murder you. So Shang-Chi is definitely a very big issue, especially if you don't have priority or you don't have an answer. This thing could really mess you up. Your opponent having priority and then they having arrow could also be a big deal, right? So you think, okay, I'm going to play She-Hulk arrow, but they have priority and they arrow you, so your arrow doesn't do anything at all. So that's definitely a way to lose a game you've thought you've won because you don't have priority. Same thing is if they have priority and then they also use Cosmo efficiently. So normally people will play Cosmo on 3, but if they know your Shuri deck, well, they could play Cosmo on 4. And if they have priority, boom, they play the Cosmo, you play the Shuri into the Cosmo. Well, you've lost your Shuri proc. You also play 3 power. It's really bad. So I think that's maybe more high level, but it's definitely something that could happen to you and can definitely make you instantly lose a game. So be aware of that. And then the last thing, this is more of like a tech strategy. It's not like a clear or a guaranteed weakness, but Storm actually does pretty well into Shuri most of the time because you play Storm on 3, and what do they play on 4? They play the Shuri. So they're really only contesting your Storm lane with 2 power. A lot of times it's very easy to just play anything in that Storm lane and you win that. The downside is they could Armanzola you, but Armanzola is pretty telegraphed, and a lot of people are not running Armanzola in their Shuri decks right now. So a lot of times you just won that lane without really trying. and like you just have to win one other lane. So it's a lot less of a risk, right? Their lanes are more telegraphed since they can only work with two, and you've already won one of the lanes, so half of the job is done. So I think that's another interesting strategy you could use if you're just fighting nonstop Shuri players. You could just say, okay, let me try adding Storm and seeing if I could do something with this. So that's another strategy I would consider. But there's not really a lot of weaknesses for the deck. This deck is strong. This deck is good. So the counters are few and far between. And lastly, we're going to talk about some example builds. So first of all, this is a little bit different than the one we have. We don't have Sola anymore. We don't have Typhoid Mary. We've kind of replaced that with Scorpion and Polaris. Scorpion is more early game. It actually, even though it only has 2 power, it ends up affecting a lot of cards they play. So it ends up being like a 4 or 5 power card. So it actually fits in our game style of lowering how much power they can do in the early game. And then Polaris is just a very nice 3-drop, has some tech uses, and also just has a lot of stats for the cost. So really good card to add in this composition. Next up, we have kind of the same thing, but now we have Cosmo in there, right? So Cosmo now being more of the tech choice. We've taken out Titania just because if you don't have the zero synergy, it's a little bit risky. But we've kept the Polaris and we've added a Maximus in there now. So now Maximus is another good card to fight for the board. It also combos well with the Cosmo. So you have more ways to affect the board. You have the counterplay, and I can go Shuri into Red Skull in that Cosmo lane. So this is another way of utilizing the early game aggression and the safety of a Cosmo. Now, for the third and fourth build, these are more Soren-esque builds. So we've added the Soren in, and we've just kind of warped the deck a little bit now to accommodate the Soren. Now we have Typhoid Mary back. It works very well with Soren. We also have Ebony Maw added in. Works very well with Soren. Also works very well with Zero. And just some other pieces to kind of fit into that composition. We do have a Chavez in one of them. The other one, we have the She-Hulk back. So just kind of mixing and matching, trying to find what works best for you. So this one deck might not work exactly perfectly for you, but you're kind of seeing some of these strategies and adjustments you can make to kind of make it make sense for your metagame, for your bubble. So always keep that in mind. And finally, we have a nice composition that I wanted to run without an arrow. So instead of arrow, we have vision in there. So vision kind of is another tool to work with the Shuri. Also have the Cosmo in there as well. So I'm just kind of trying to find a build. If you don't have arrow and you're like, oh, I don't have arrow, I can't play this. Well, you could. You can still play this, right? Just try to find an alternative card that works well into the composition. So those are just some of the ideas that I want you to always be thinking about. You don't have to run that cookie cutter build. Surprise cards do so much damage in this game. And if you can just add something they don't expect, add something that makes sense but isn't completely standard, that can be significantly better than having a deck list that everyone knows every single card that is in your composition. So overall, that Shuri was a very popular request that people were asking for since it's one of the top meta guides. And I'm still working on gameplay. So essentially, for the YouTube videos that the YouTube audience doesn't really know, my MMR right now is too high, so I don't fight players. I basically fight bots. There's currently one other player in my MMR bracket, so if we both queue at the same time, I'll get him nonstop. But other than that one person, I don't fight anyone else really. They're not high enough. So it's hard to get gameplay guides or gameplay videos because it's just bots. Um, I'm considering making gameplay videos regardless or doing friendly battles, but that requires like another person, and I work like late in the night a lot of times, and it doesn't feel right to say, hey, wake up at 11 p.m. so you can record a video for me for no reason. But overall, that's my Shuri deck list. Hopefully, you guys can take this and use this in your own games, and we'll see you in the next one.